Today I'm going to explain to you why the overhead press is not a shoulder exercise. And I'm going to do that by using a banana. Before I use the banana to show you, two quick things. I want to first qualify my statement of it's not a shoulder exercise because the word shoulder is kind of vague. And I want to just show you the anatomy of the muscles I'm talking about. So first things first, when I say that the overhead press is not a shoulder exercise, what I mean is it's not an overall deltoid exercise, which is what people often think and claim about the overhead press. So what are the different deltoids? Well, there are three. And the deltoid, by the way, is just this big bulky thing on the side of your arm. There's the front deltoid, which basically runs down in this direction from the clavicle, right, the collarbone here, onto the upper arm. And so that's what's highlighted in green. There's the middle delt, which kind of runs down to the side like that. And that's basically what people are looking for, when they're trying to get capped delts, make their shoulders wider. And then there's the rear delt, and the rear delt basically just sits on the back side of the upper arm. So here we're looking at the front, here's the back, and the rear delt basically completes the back side of the capped shoulder. And so again, just to repeat and qualify my claims specifically, what I mean to say with this overall video is that the overhead press is a front delt exercise. It's not a middle delt exercise, and it's certainly not a rear delt exercise. And again, I think a lot of people are confused about this because as they're doing the overhead press, they just get a general sense that there's a lot of sensation in their shoulder area, which is totally fine and which is probably normal. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that all these heads are getting trained. So let me show you with a banana why this is the case. All right, so first things first, muscle recruitment is fundamentally a story of how we interact with the external forces of any scenario. In other words, the direction of resistance, in other words, what the forces of an exercise are doing to you, they're what determines what happens from a muscle recruitment standpoint. And so in a sense, what you can view muscles as is just these little responders that are basically acting based on the forces imposed. Think about it this way before I describe this with my banana. What's the fundamental difference between a pressing exercise and a pulling exercise? Well, me moving my arms is exactly the same. And without any context, I could be doing a press, I could be doing a pull, right? And what makes the difference in terms of the muscle recruitment is whether there's a load trying to push me backward, i.e. a bench press, or something trying to pull me forward, i.e. a row. And so when it comes to the overhead press, we need to think about the same thing. And when we think about the overhead press, we need to think about the different portions of the deltoid in the anatomy we just described. So the starting position of an overhead press is something like this, which is our first sort of signal as to what is actually working in this exercise. Because when we rotate the arm in this direction, what's going to happen is our arm is going to get pushed directly downward. Okay? And the simple way to think about this is if our resistance is pushing us in this direction, the thing that is on top of this joint in this position is going to be the thing to pull the arm upward. And so we simply just have to ask, okay, if our banana, which represents the front delt in this case, is basically the thing, if you imagine the arm in this position, is the thing that rotates back with the arm and then comes on top of the joint completely, that is the thing that is going to oppose the resistance from smushing us down to the floor. Now, a lot of people call the overhead press a middle delt exercise. And the reason I disagree with that is just from a first principles perspective, what happens when we put the arm in the position that is required of us in an overhead press, and then also what the resistance of an overhead press is as we've gone over. So think about it this way. If this is our middle delt normally, right, just crossing the top side of this joint and running down kind of on the side, and what I do is I take my arm up and out here and I rotate my arm backward like this. Do you all see, hopefully maybe this perspective is easier, how when the arm rotates backward this way, what the banana does is the banana rotates kind of backward with the arm. In other words, when I rotate my arm backward to this degree, what my middle delt would actually want to do in this position is not pull upward, right? Because it's not sitting on top of the joint anymore, it's sitting slightly behind. So the middle delt from this position would more reasonably actually pull the arm sort of backward and outward. And this is why you feel your middle delt when you do something like a Y raise with a cable or a dumbbell. And then lastly, if you think about the rear delt and the anatomy of the rear delt, this is kind of crazy how you would think that the rear delt could possibly pull the arm upward, right? Because the rear delt sits below this joint, and from this position, the rear delt would pull the arm down. I've heard people recently say something along the lines of, your rear delt functions as a stabilizer. And I'm like, okay, well, what does that really mean? Because it's not opposing the resistance at all. Sure, is it contracting to some degree to basically just hold the joint and center the joint? Yes, but we don't call the overhead press a rear delt exercise, much in the same way that we don't call a bench press an upper back or a lat exercise. So again, from this position, the thing that resists our arm being smushed downward is the front delt moving upward. If our rear delts were to contract in this position, it would pull our arm downward and behind our body. And if our middle delts were to contract from this position, it would actually probably want to rotate our arm a little bit internally and upward toward the side, as in something like a Y raise. So this is not at all to say that the overhead press is a bad exercise, right? It's a bad exercise if you're trying to train your rear delts or your middle delts, but it's a great exercise if you want to train your front delts, perhaps your triceps, depending on the implement you're using, and your traps, so that you can, rotate your shoulder girdle upward as you do the press. So keep in mind, this video is not to just bash the overhead press and say that you shouldn't do it or it's a waste of time. It's simply just to say that it's not a shoulder exercise in the way that you might think. And so instead, what I would recommend for rear delts, just stick with your reverse flies and your rows, and for middle delts, spam those lateral raises.